All right, we are finishing up the last 2 points on lesson 8, dealing with the part 3 of defeated neo-Darwinian dogmas. And then we're covering our questions. We talked about vestigial organs and how that there was a book that is still, a whole lot of those that are listed in that book are still widely repeated as still containing vestigial organs, but no organ has yet been proved useless. All of them have been proven to be considered useful. Now, there is a big difference between vital organs and beneficial organs, and a lot of times I think people confuse the two, and they think, well, these aren't vital organs, but that doesn't mean that they're vestigial. Vestigial means they do nothing; they serve no purpose. And yet, we talked about several organs, several examples of those organs. Like the appendix, the tonsils that deal with the immune system. Talk about the tailbone, that's not an organ, but the tailbone, you've got a whole bunch of muscles connecting it. It provides support when you're sitting, when you're standing. Talked about hair and the purpose that hair serves on the human body. You talk about wings of flightless birds and how that they are involved in helping, we got things like, he even mentions there's ostrich and, of course we think about chickens and things like that provide balance, that helps with heat dissipation, it protects young. You got hip bones and whales, which for a long time were considered to be vestigial, and yet we found out, no, those actually support the internal organs. There's a whole bunch of muscles that are attached there. It helps them in the mating process. And so all of those have been proven to be false, and now there's not a single vestigial organ in anything that can be considered to be vestigial. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that it's not vital or that it's vital, but it does serve and continues to serve a purpose. All right, so let's cover our questions for lesson 8. True or false? There is no observable variation within finches. False. Yeah, remember Darwin, he observed what he considered to be 14 separate subspecies of finches, but the reality, remember as Josh went through that example, now they're considering actually that they were all one species, because they all would, even though they varied within generations, they all would kind of go back to this baseline size of beaks and things. So now they're considering it's not 14 subspecies, they were actually all one. Number 2, Darwin's finches display variation within an animal kind, just as the Bible teaches. True. Yeah, true. They're birds. They're just a sub-kind of bird, and certainly what Darwin observed were variation within those finches, and that's exactly what the Bible teaches. Number 3, mutations in animals lead to macroevolution. False. Yeah, that's one of the most commonly cited mechanisms by which Darwinian evolution occurs, and yet not only has it not been proven, it's been disproven. Again, 99% of all mutations are negative with no beneficial attributes provided. The other 1% is give and take. You may have one beneficial element that comes from some mutation, but on the other hand, there's some kind of counter to it. So it's not like it's a progression. And we'll talk more about the PBS thing that Josh mentioned. Number 4, observed physical mutations hinder rather than help an animal's chances for survival. True. Yeah, true. Talk about the 2 sets of wings on a fruit fly. As cool as it is, it didn't help it at all. Number 5, we must trust all the opinions of scientists because they're the experts. Yeah, I told the teenagers that Josh dropped the ball on that one. No, that wasn't. Yeah, go ahead.
That 99.1%, that's being generous.
That's being very generous. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. All right, fill in the blank. I've been, kind of going through this one at a time, but I'm not going to do that anymore. So, with number 1, what scripture is being quoted here? Genesis 1:24. Let the earth bring forth a living creature according to its kind, cattle, creeping thing, and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. Number 2, how much of a percentage of all mutations are negative? 99%. And again, as Dwayne mentioned, that's a very well, depending on how you look at it, conservative or liberal number, but it's a very lenient number, I guess you could say. They're all negative, or not over 90%, 99% of all mutations are negative, and work to the what rather than the what? Yeah, the detriment rather to the beneficial. Yep. Number 3, what is a process utilized to search for every mutation in the development of an animal that has failed to find one PBS mutation? It's kind of a tough one. It's saturation mutagenesis. Yeah, that's the process that is utilized for that. Number 4, some previously considered vestigial organs that are now considered useful include what? Appendix. Tail, well, yeah, it's not an organ. One of the kids pointed out, I had tailbone on here too. One of the kids was, that's not an organ. Yeah, that's true. Tonsils, spleen was mentioned in one of the lists, I think. Human hair, technically, hair is part of like the organ process in humans. But I also included the tailbone here because that was one he went through as well. Number 5, what scripture is being quoted for number 5? 2 Peter 2, verses 1 through 3, well, mainly verse 2, yeah. Many will follow there. I don't know what translation Josh is using. He's got sensuality for that scripture. Some of these words might be slightly different depending on your translation. But many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of the truth will be maligned. Okay, again, that's another word that's probably a little bit different in some of your other versions. And their greed, they will exploit you with what? False words. All right, number 6, for a mutation to be considered evolutionarily significant or useful, it must meet the what test? PBS. And what does PBS stand for? Persistent, beneficial, structural. Yep. Persistent, beneficial, and structural. Not one of the 3. It has to be all 3. Okay, let's see. We've got short answer. Explain the difference between the early 19th century teaching of the Church of England regarding the fixity of species versus the actual biblical teaching of the fixity of kinds. What was the difference? And I thought that was really interesting. That was something that I hadn't heard about before regarding kind of some of the teachings. And again, I don't know if that stemmed from a Catholic teaching, but Josh focused on Darwin's experience, and that was with the Anglican Church, the Church of England, that taught this fixity of species, which their version of that means that cats and tigers, those are all different kinds. Whereas a cat and a tiger, what kind is it? It's a feline. Okay, it's just a variation of a feline. And over generations, you can have bigger felines, you can have smaller felines, or what we will call subkinds, but it's all one kind, just like with canines. Okay, dogs would be the same way. The biblical teaching of that is that, can a dog become a cat? No. Okay, you can't go beyond that kind. It stays within that realm. That doesn't mean they don't change over time. They do. But they stay within that realm, which includes humans. Number 2, explain why antibiotic resistance in bacteria and pesticide resistance in insects are not proof of neo-Darwinian evolution. Ultimately, remember, he mentioned the fact that within some of these mutations, even if there's the mutation element that is taking place in bacteria and stuff that might be resistant to antibiotics and stuff, there's a give and take in that mutation. We talk about COVID-19, and there was a whole lot of variations that have come out over the last couple of years, and a lot of times they'll even talk about on the news or whatever, when we talk about that variation, this one seems to be more contagious, but has lesser symptoms, or vice versa. And so there's going to be a give and take with that. That doesn't mean it's evolved. In the purest sense, I guess you could say it is, because evolution simply means change. But it doesn't mean that it's somehow macroevolving, or that's not proof of macroevolution. And one of the other points that he made about that as well is ultimately it's really just a sign of what you would call microevolution, or survival of the fittest. I mean, if you start off with 50 non-antibiotic resistant bacteria and 50 resistant bacteria, and you start eliminating the non-resistant bacteria, what are you going to be left with most of? The resistant. Okay, so you're gonna, when you start eliminating one, you're gonna have more of another, and that's gonna fluctuate over time as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all of our bugs, all of our colds and flus are all evolving to become resistant to all medicine. It just means that maybe they've always been there, but some have, you can't kind of always tell the difference between the two. Some respond to medicine, some don't. But once you start eliminating some of those, then you're going to see more of the other. Then number 3, we just named some supposedly vestigial organs. Number 4, how many years did evolutionist George Gaylord Simpson say would theoretically be necessary for good evolutionary results to occur? 274 billion years. But how old is the world according to evolutionists? 6.5. 6.5 billion years. Yeah. So, you're talking tens and tens of a difference of multiples there, difference and that's just one good evolutionary result. We're not talking going from some primitive form of primate to human. And so I do want to mention that as well, by the way. It used to be that chart and some, it's still in some textbooks, and I'm not necessarily saying that it's not still taught, but you see that going from the monkey gradually to an ape, gradually to a human, okay, is considered the kind of the evolution of man. Well, one thing that I've been hearing a lot lately in the comments of our YouTube videos is, no, that's not true. They're saying that both monkeys and apes and humans all evolved from the same creature or same primitive ancestor. Okay, whatever. That may very well be what they're saying now. That's not what they used to say before. So we talk about, well, why didn't the apes get the memo? I still consider that to be a problem, because why would you go from a primitive ancestor to a more complex descendant, which is us, and yet still have relatively primitive primitive descendants in the ape and in the monkey? It just doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. Number 5, provide 3 reasons why the argument that vestigial organs prove neo-Darwinian evolution should not be taught. One of the biggest issues is that was a major assumption, but they lacked the actual medical knowledge and medical technology to prove it. So basically, you're assuming you got to be able to prove that it's vestigial. You can't just say, well, it doesn't seem to do anything. That doesn't prove anything. You actually have to prove it doesn't do anything. And the reverse has been true. We've been proving these supposed vestigial organs have actually continued to function or serve a purpose. Then you have what would be ultimately complex. If these organs all served purposes before but no longer do, you're going from a complex organism to what? Less complex, but you still have the organs. And we talked last week about appendicitis, okay? And especially in like an emergency situation where you have an appendix that is about to burst or has burst, what can happen if that's not treated? You could die, okay? Well, if that appendix supposedly does nothing, what evolutionary purpose does it serve other than to actually be a hindrance from survival? And that's exactly what it would be. So you've got a more complex evolving into a less complex, and yet still holding on to things that actually would be a detriment to it, which is the exact opposite of what macroevolution claims to have happen. You also have physicians who for years were saying, no, this is not true, these things do. We see correlation in immune systems and things like that. And yet for years, scientists kind of ignored that. But then there was a 4th reason that he gave as well, is that most actual knowledgeable evolutionists, they don't use that argument at all because they know it doesn't prove anything. All right. Anything else through lesson 8? Lesson 9. All right, so lesson 9 talks about the geologic column, the fossil record, and there's a lot of details in this, especially once you start getting into like the specific examples. Like the Grand Canyon is perhaps one of the most famous because you can actually see the different strata levels. And according to geologists and evolutionists, these different strata, these different colored layers of not soil, but ground, represents millions of years. And yet, in many cases, there are plenty of examples, not just in the Grand Canyon, but elsewhere as well, where you have upright fossils. Some are trees that have just all of a sudden, and yet they cross, because they've been buried upright. In theory, that means that they are in that geologic strata over the course of hundreds of millions of years. Well, that obviously doesn't make any sense. And so a lot of times these scientists will say, well, that's an exception to the rule. But there are even fossils that have been found standing upright. Okay, like they've been covered so quickly that they didn't even have time to fall over. They're upright or at an angle. And that doesn't make any sense either. And so then you start getting into the, oh, well, that's an exception, that's an exception. But the geologic column, in order for macroevolution to be accurate, to be true, it has to contain irrefutable evidence, especially in the form of those transitional fossils, moving from one kind to a new kind. Not just variation of a kind. Okay, that is not proof. You have to have that transition from one kind to a different kind. There's something called uniformitarianism, and that's there's a kind of an opposite to that as well. Josh doesn't get into that, but the uniformitarianism suggests that there is a gradual process by which all of this sediment has been placed in layers, and that process takes place over the same amount of time as it does today. So there's a lot of assumptions that takes place that over millions of years, this sediment is laid down on the ground the same speed as it does now. And so that's kind of where they get this, this association of dating. But they make three assumptions. And the first one is that the oldest, that is the deepest layers, should contain the earliest, the most undeveloped life forms. Okay, so you're talking about your most basic life forms at the very bottom. Okay, if you were to dig straight down, you should be able to find the most basic. And then if you were to take a core sample, okay, the very bottom would be the most basic, and then you should be able to line it up as these different fossils come along. You should be able to see them gradually get more and more developed, more advanced, is the idea. And that's the second assumption, is that the youngest layers, that's the most shallowest, or the shallower layers, contain the newest, most developed life forms. Then in between, you're supposed to have these transitional fossils. Okay? Now, on the creationist side, that's the side that we would be on, believing that God created all things. The idea of creationism, the way the Bible describes God creating things, the geologic strata should show, there's four things it should show. Okay, this is what's predicted. That there is a sudden appearance, not a gradual appearance, a sudden appearance of fully formed life. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have both basic and complex life. It means that all of it appears all at once. Secondly, if believing in God, believing in God's creating the heavens and the earth the way that he did in Genesis, then we would predict to see within the strata that no life in the oldest layers prior to God creating the sea and animal life on days 5 and 6. So days 1 through 4 basically are being represented in everything Precambrian or even lower than that, because that's where God divided the firmament and he set the waters from the land and all of that takes place there. Even the plants that he creates within that as well. And those, I think that was day 2, day 3, he creates the plants. So there are bacteria, maybe some seeds on those lower levels, but no animal fossils. Which means that the earliest, the deepest layers are going to contain probably the less mobile life that was unable when the flood started to escape to higher ground. And so that's one of the things that Josh points out, is that when the flood came, some of the less mobile life, you might find more fossils of that on the lower levels, because remember, all that sediment from the flood is then going to cover all of those layers. So on the deepest layers where we find life, you're going to find the animals that would have died first in the flood. They would have been less complex. They would have been unable to escape a lot of the floodwaters. And then fourthly, is that all animals are found in the fossil form. They're fully formed. And they're distinct kinds. There's not going to be any kind of transitional moving from a bird or from a dinosaur to a bird, for instance. They're all going to be their own kind. It's going to be recognizable. All right. So, if evidence of macroevolution can't be found in the fossil record, then it's not going to be found anywhere. Okay. Despite all of the logical reasoning that scientists try to go through and all of that, in the end, what they lack is actual, what we would say, the smoking gun type of thing. This is the actual proof, and it's irrefutable. Now, first of all, throughout this lesson, what did Josh say about transitional fossils? Have they actually found anything that's irrefutable to be a transitional fossil from one kind to a new kind? No. No. And part of the issues with that is how they go about dating strata and dating fossils within the strata. And there's I was going to put it on the PowerPoint, but I decided not to. But there's a kind of a funny little cartoon on page 83 that kind of shows the circular logic that a lot of times these scientists go through. Because the most common method for geologic dating, we talked about radiometric dating, we talked about radiocarbon and using uranium to lead and that sort of thing. But the most common way that they date fossils is by dating the strata. Well, how do you determine how old the strata is? It's based on what you find in terms of fossils. And so you go have this back and forth, and they use index fossils. In other words, we think that this particular fossil was probably formed around 350 million years ago. So the strata in which it's found in is therefore dated to 350 million years ago. Well, how do you know that the bone that you found, or the fossil that you found, is 350 million years old? Because we found it in 350 million year old strata or ground. And you've got this back and forth. And I didn't include this quote on the slides, but I thought this was really important. He points this out. This is the top page of page 83, second column. He mentions a Victorian philosopher. He was an evolutionist. He was a devout atheist, but he took issue with the unscrupulous and dishonorable practice among the scientific community in 1859. Herbert Spencer, Josh says, he derided the unprincipled technique of using index fossils to date geologic strata. He was disheartened with the dishonesty of a system that often turned up fossils in the wrong strata, invalidating the method entirely. Nevertheless, what does he say? Do they still use it today? They still use it today. Okay, and it's that circular logic, that circular reasoning. Again, because when you start using radiometric dating, whatever method that they might utilize to measure either rocks or the fossil or whatever, you're going to have all these varied ranging dates all over the place. We talked about that when we talked about radiometric dating. And so they have to be able to have some sort of historical narrative, some kind of geologic record that they have already established for everything to fit properly. But what happens when fossils don't fit where they're supposed to fit? It just blows up everything. And that's part of the problem that they're dealing with now, is that fossils are turning up in strata that they're not supposed to be in. Josh points out that and he has a list here at the bottom of page 83 on that second column. There's a list of multiple life forms that were supposed to have evolved millions of years later than where they ended up being found. And so they had the index fossils that told them, okay, well, this layer is 500 million years old. But then they find fossils in that layer that are only 100 million years old. Well, how did they get there? They're not supposed to be there. But we don't know how they got there. And so some of these outlier type of examples you don't never hear about, because it serves the purpose of creating doubt, not only in the dating methods, but in the narrative that's trying to be pushed, that this has been proven. We have proven macroevolution, when in fact there are holes all through it. Thoughts or comments to that? All right, he mentions how that there's over 1,000 fossil families from 1982 to 1992 that were discovered to be much older than scientists originally thought they were. And in some cases, they are far too old to be evolutionarily possible. In other words, they found what was supposed to have evolved from this or that, but they found it in layers prior to where it had supposedly evolved from. And so it's not possible that they could possibly be there, and yet they've been found there. And this creates a major issue. But what do they not find? They don't find what's called transitional fossils. Again, that is not to say that they don't find variation of fossils. They do, all over the place, okay? That's variation within a kind. It's like finding a cat and finding a tiger bone, or fossil. Again, fossils aren't technically bones. So you have tiger fossils, you have cat fossils. Okay?
Just look at the variation between us.
Oh, yeah. Actually, and I wish I had detailed, I should have thought to ask my mom about that. But she actually, there's a preacher, at least he used to be a preacher in Australia. His name was Philip, I can't remember his last name. But anyway, he was a preacher in Australia. And he actually did, I want to say he went around doing kind of not just sermons, but specific, like a series of lessons or a series of like a mini series type of thing. And he actually brought skulls with him. And these skulls, many of these skulls were supposedly representative like of Australopithecus and all these pre-humanoid or pre-Homo sapien ancestors of man. And yet they were modern skulls. They were skulls of people who lived in the last 100 years. Okay, some of these furrowed brows, okay? In fact, he even has kind of like different skulls that are representative of people from different places in the world. So you had, people from Africa and that kind of skull. You had people from Asia and that kind of skull. And the different variations of those skulls. And how, if you didn't understand or know the different variation of human skulls, you might think you're looking at a whole long evolution of man's skulls going from maybe bigger skull and a big furrowed brow, looks like a Neanderthal, to something more modern. And yet these were all modern skulls. And that just goes to show, to remind us that, there are human beings that have skulls that are very little different from what would be termed Neanderthals. That doesn't make them, I'm saying they're stupid, they're not. They're human beings. They're just as intelligent. It's just a difference of bone density and bone formation. And primarily based on where they were born, and kind of the DNA structure of where they were born, what part of the world they were born in. And so to me, that really was a major problem. If you're trying to date things and all you have is a skull, oh, this skull looks like, a primitive man, so we're going to go back and say he was an ape. We'll call him the pit down man, or whatever the I forget what the scientific name for him was, or for, what was it, the Lucy link, the missing link that they said they found and so forth. None of it's accurate. It's simply based on a narrative that they're trying to push. And what are often touted to be missing links are actually only gaps in the fossil record. There is a huge difference between what's called a missing link, and you hear that a lot, missing link found. But it's just a gap in the fossil record, meaning and this is within the section, this is page 85, I think it is, 84 and 85, where Josh goes through and he talks about how that sometimes scientists, they'll find a wing, and they'll extrapolate from that wing what the rest of that animal must have looked like. Or they find a skull, or they find a spine, but they don't find anything else. And so they've extrapolated what they think this animal might have looked like, but they're missing a whole bunch in terms of the fossils. And then what they do find a lot of times don't fit right because it's a variation of that fossil. So they think it's a missing link, when in fact, they've already got this in their mind, what that animal must have looked like. This bone doesn't fit with this animal, or this fossil doesn't fit with this animal, so it must represent a more evolved version. When in fact, no, that's the missing gap of the fossil record that you don't have. You've made assumptions based on your own thought of wisdom and thought of knowledge that you think that this is how this animal must have looked like. How long were we told that dinosaurs were smooth, scaly, snake-like creatures? And what are we learning now? They had feathers. Okay, a lot of these, they're finding actual entire, kind of the remains of epidermis, or what's left of the epidermis. They're finding feathers on these dinosaurs. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, they were saying dinosaurs were these smooth-skinned, reptile-like creatures, and now we're finding all these finding out many of them were feathered instead of just what would look reptilian. Dr. Schwartz in 1999, this is somebody he quotes from a lot, it's an evolutionist, says instead of filling in the gaps in the fossil record with so-called missing links, most paleontologists find themselves facing a situation in which there were only gaps in the fossil record, with no evidence of transformational evolutionary intermediates between documented fossil species. And that's the key component to it. What they're saying is a missing link. It's a missing link in the fossil record. It's not a missing link in the changing of one kind to a new kind. So in a lot of ways, it's actually kind of deceiving. It's very deceitful to use that phrase, missing link, because you could say that and say, well, I'm talking about the fossil record. But most human beings, most people who aren't really studied up on this, are they going to get that nuance? No, they're not going to get that nuance. They're going to assume you mean this is a missing link from one kind to a new kind. And so it's very kind of deceitful, very mischievous how they do that. He mentions there's several quotes in here about specific animals as well. The oldest known snakes, for instance, in the fossil record, have no intermediate form. They're no different from snakes of today. Now, in the chapter, what other animal didn't change? Our previous chapter, what other animal didn't change over millions of years? Supposedly, horses. Okay, the horse fossil record is exactly the same over the course of millions of years. So unless you're going to argue that evolution simply decided, well, it's a perfect form, I can't improve on it, so I'm just going to leave it that way, then you have to come to the conclusion that, well, it didn't evolve because it can't. It's stuck to a single form. It's that kind that it is. And the same way with snakes. Okay, I mean, there's variations of snakes. There's variations of lethality of snakes, of venom and non-venom and so forth. But the snakes have always been the same since the Garden of Eden anyway. Okay, prior to man being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, what did at least that snake have? It had some form by which it didn't have to slither on the ground. Most assume that it had some form of legs or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. Some have even theorized that maybe it had wings. How terrifying would that be? But whatever it didn't have, whatever it had, God took that away and forced it to slither on the ground. So at least from the point of the Garden of Eden, snakes since then, they have not changed at all. Turtles, and this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. He talks about turtles and how, or the encyclopedia talks about the origin of turtles, how it's obscured by the lack of early fossils. They said this is an extraordinary example of evolution, but what did they not find? Intermediates are completely lacking. We have no idea how turtles came to be turtles. And we really wish we did, because turtles are an amazing piece of engineering, but there's no proof or no evidence of how they got to that point. Jeffrey Schwartz, I was trying to think of his first name. But this is a really interesting one as well, and I think this is actually really important. He says that we are still in the dark about the origin of most major groups of organisms. They appear in the fossil record, and he mentions, as Athena did from the head of Zeus, full-blown and raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution as resulting from the gradual accumulation of countless infinitesimally minute variations. Now, again, that's not to say that there aren't minute variations within a kind. It's that those minute variations do not build up to creating a new kind. And that's the difference. And then this one, and this is actually a really interesting one as well, something I hadn't thought about, but Josh quotes, I think this is Dr. Knox in 1994, many people suppose that phylogeny, that's the study of the genetic association and ancestry and so forth, can be discovered directly from the fossil record by studying a graded series of old to young fossils and by discovering ancestors. But this is not true. Notice what he says. There is no way of knowing whether a fossil is a direct ancestor of a more recent species, or it represents a line of descent, a lineage that simply became extinct. Now, I thought that was really interesting, and I hadn't thought about that before, but think about how many species, subspecies of a kind, became extinct in the flood. Now, God, he made sure that kinds were spared in the ark, but we're not told how many variations of kinds were saved. So there may have been a whole lot of sub-kinds that were lost in the flood and that never came back. And I hadn't really thought about that before, that a lot of the things that they're finding, they are assuming there's a link to something today, when these things actually could have just gone extinct. And there is nothing, no link, and of course there isn't a link, but there's nothing even associated with it today. I think it's kind of interesting. Fossil record indicates that simple and complex life suddenly appeared all at once in what's called the Cambrian explosion. All of a sudden, in this certain strata of geologic strata, all of a sudden, that's where you find life. You don't find the varied and distinct life prior to that. All of a sudden, it's in this point. And as believers in God, we would associate this with when God created the heavens and the earth, but then specifically days 5 and 6, when he created the ocean life, he created animal life. That's when it all appeared. And of course, associated in that as well would be all those animals that may have died in the flood, because that would be the same layer. Very few discoveries have ever been fully agreed upon by evolutionists as representing intermediate links to ancestral animals. This is from Josh himself. He said, among the few transitional fossils that have been suggested, all are highly dubious and questionable at best, or utterly erroneous and or falsified at worst. And he gave a couple of examples, one of them being the Archaeopteryx. And this was a bird-like, what was supposed to have been a dinosaur. Now, when they found it, they were all excited, saying this is the missing link, because they, for years, were saying that dinosaurs, one kind of section of dinosaurs going along with the pterodactyl and so forth, turned into birds. And that's what we have from birds today. Come to find out, the use of this example is especially misleading because the majority of evolutionists no longer believe that that's an example of an evolutionary transition. It's actually a bird. And Josh, there's like 4 or 5 different points that he makes in that to show that this is a bird. There is nothing here that you would associate with what's quote unquote a dinosaur. Was it a bigger bird than most? Sure. But just because it's bigger doesn't mean it's a dinosaur. So there's that association where you're making that assumption, and now Darwinists are like, yeah, it's just a bird. Birds are found earlier in the fossil record than the dinosaurs that they're supposed to have been descended from. That's a pretty serious problem, and there are other inconsistencies with the bird from dinosaur theories. That's from Oregon State University in 2009. For hundreds of years, 150 years at least, scientists have been teaching dinosaurs produce birds. And no, that's not how that worked. Birds existed at the very least at the same time, if not prior to dinosaurs. Okay, perfect, because the very next page we're talking about our questions. So we will cover our questions for this is lesson 9. Keynote for next week. Lesson 10 is a very short lesson. So our goal for next week is going to be to cover our questions for lesson 9, cover not only our lesson for lesson 10, but also the questions for lesson 10, and get as far into lesson 11 as we can for next week. Okay, so go ahead and plan to have our questions done for lesson 9 and lesson 10, because Lord willing, we will cover both next week. Thank you, everybody.